Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Campfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. This episode of Victor's Children is about understanding Russia today in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine. We're going to be focusing on understanding Russian society. If people who are listening are interested in what the stance of socialists should be in relation to the war, I would suggest you could check out an episode of the Solidarity Winnipeg podcast that I participated in recently, which is called Russia Out of Ukraine and No to NATO Too. But we're going to be focusing today on Russia, and I'm very happy to welcome back to Victor's Children, Simon Pirani. So, Simon, could you introduce yourself and say something about your background in relation to this topic?
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you for inviting me. I've been involved in radical politics and socialist politics since I was a teenager, and I started traveling to Russia and Ukraine and other parts of the Soviet Union in the Soviet period, just at the end of the Soviet period. I wrote a PhD thesis, which became a book, about what had gone wrong between the working class and the Bolsheviks in the early 1920s. And I've continued to follow Russia and Ukraine as a journalist and subsequently as a researcher of energy issues. And the war, which has unfolded over the past 10 days, has come as a great shock to people like me who are supposed to understand what's going on. I didn't expect it, but I'm not alone. I think many people who claim to understand Russia and Ukraine didn't expect it. And it will force us to look at our views and look at Russia and Ukraine in a new way.
Yeah. And, you know, when you say that most people didn't see it coming, I think that's true from many different perspectives. And people who are trying to make sense of this, certainly in the Anglosphere, if they're listening to the mainstream media, they're not going to find very much there that's useful for understanding Russian society. So can you step back and give us a kind of a quick overview about the shape of capitalism in Russia today, including what the most important sections of the capitalist class are?
Yeah, so I think the best way to do that is chronologically, if you like. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the country's assets, which had been owned by the state, were quite rapidly brought, not entirely, but largely into the private sphere. And as the economy collapsed in the 1990s, and both Russia and Ukraine suffered the greatest peacetime slump that economists have recorded in the 1990s, and during that slump, the pieces of the state-owned economy, which did not stay in the state's hands, were picked up by various business groups. And quite often, these groups were formed out of an alliance of former bureaucrats, people who had power in the state by virtue of jobs as ministers or as senior officials in ministries, and very often criminal or semi-criminal groups, because armed force was needed to actually take control of those assets in many parts of Russia. And that, to my understanding, is the meaning of oligarchs. The oligarchy became very powerful at that point, and I always defined oligarchs as politically influential businessmen, and they are all men. I've seen on social media, friends and comrades sort of saying in the last few days, well, it's all very well when it's Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, we call them billionaires, and when it's Russia, we call them oligarchs, and aren't we seeing things through a different set of lenses? And obviously, for many people in the Anglosphere, that may be true. I'm sure not the the very politically discerning listeners to your podcast, David. But certainly the reason we used to talk about oligarchs in the 1990s was because of that kind of marriage of parts of the old bureaucracy with these criminal or semi-criminal gangs who took control then of large parts of the most effectively revenue-generating parts of the economy, which was the oil, gas, metal and minerals companies. And it's in those companies that throughout the post-Soviet period, the wealth of Russia has accumulated, and they have generated they completely dominate the export revenues that Russia earns from exporting goods to the world market. And essentially, Russia was brought into the world capitalist economy in the 1990s and early 2000s as an exporter of those commodities. And I checked on these figures last year for some research I was doing. And just in recent years, so just in the sort of 5-year period before the pandemic, oil contributed 45% of the total revenues for the export of goods, and gas 12%. That's total 57%. And then if you add to that the coal, metals and minerals, there's not a lot left. And Russia's not a big exporter of services. Now, if you look at GDP, the share of oil and gas is lower, so it's about a quarter. But it's those export revenues that really tell you the story. And the next chapter, if you like, after the 1990s, so Putin comes in as president on, I think, the 1st of January 2000. And I think of this as being a turning point when we go from a weak state, which is struggling to get these business groups to pay taxes for a start, and also struggling to retain control over the territory, particularly in Caucasus, with the very strong nationalist movements there. And Putin really represents an aspiration to and the implementation of a stronger state. So first of all, we have the Second Chechen War, which is in progress when Putin takes over, and which he finishes off very quickly and very bloodily. The war in which there were multiple war crimes, destruction of the capital of Chechnya, Grozny, with carpet bombing, with the Western powers completely looking the other way. And the other side of this strong state was the changed relationship with private business. So there was a famous meeting where Putin called all the oligarchs in and said, right, guys, you're going to pay taxes now. The owner of the largest oil company, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, was arrested and spent 10 years in Siberia and then left Russia. And that company was basically confiscated in bits. And those oil fields are now in the property of Rosneft, which is the biggest oil company, which is state-owned and headed by Igor Sechin, who, like Putin, is a former KGB officer. Now, what's often come up in the discussions about the character of the capitalist class and the character of the regime is, are they all just from the KGB? And of course, there's a succession of books been written with Putin looking fierce on the cover and the Kremlin in the background and so on and so on. And, playing to this idea that, it's all about the KGB. Now, one of the most recent books, which is not in that category, and which is a very, very good piece of journalism by Catherine Belton, who works at the Financial Times. Actually, I think, although I'm not convinced by her analysis, but I think her journalistic investigation of the extent to which those former officers in the security services played a part in the transition from the Soviet system of ownership to capitalism, I actually find very, very convincing. And I mean, I knew bits of that story at the time. I wrote about it myself. But I think that with the benefit of hindsight, she's put that together and really put a strong case for there being, if not the exaggerated role of the KGB, which you could read about in the popular press in the West, anyway, a strong hand operating in many of these companies at many levels. So we then get to the 2000s. Of course, the other thing that's often not appreciated about Putin is that virtually from the week he took over, the oil price started rising. It was about $20 a barrel when Putin took over, and it doesn't really stop rising until 2008, 2009, the entire two first terms. And this was a time of absolute, this was a boom time par excellence for this new Russian bourgeoisie. Those export revenues were flowing in. The taxes were, at least to some extent, getting paid. The treasury was under the leadership of the finance minister of that time, Alexei Kudrin, who insisted on establishing this stabilization fund and for holding the revenues outside the country and not bringing them back and distributing them to all and sundry, although, with all the yachts and villas and London homes they own, there was obviously still plenty to spare after he'd taken the taxes. But anyway, we really have a decade of very rapid growth. And at that time, this comes to your question about the sort of character of the capitalist class. And I was doing quite a lot of writing just as a financial journalist about Russia, and I remember lots of meetings with people in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, other such institutions. Oh, we've got to get the small businesses going. We've got to have ways of developing a system of small loans to support small businesses, which didn't really exist because of the way that capitalism had come onto the scene. And they were hopeful. But of course, we then hit the financial crisis of 2008-9. Now, the oil prices stayed high for another 3 or 4 years after that. So there's a kind of delayed effect. But actually, if you look at those years between 2009 and 2014, the Russian economy is already stagnating, despite the fact that the commodity revenues are still rolling in. And this tells you that all that diversification is not happening. All those schemes there was progress, right? In capitalism's own terms, the banks started to lend money to small businesses and so on. But bang, with 2008 crisis, although the oil revenues still came in, all those loans are then pulled back in. A lot of the banks, as in many other countries, hit the wall, and Russia began to suffer from that crisis, as did other capitalist countries. And then we come to 2014, and the decision to annex Crimea and to support the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, which was taken in the Kremlin. And I think there's a reason. I think I understand the reason why that happened. But that was a decision which, in terms of the short-term economic interests of the Russian bourgeoisie, was an utter disaster. And the other thing I remember from working as a financial journalist or when I was with the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies and meeting with people in the energy sector is that every Russian business person you met had their head in their hands, because the annexation of Crimea absolutely predictably led to a measure of sanctions, which first of all were sanctions through the financial sector. So obviously our awful governments here, nothing was done about the villas, the London property or anything else, but there were sanctions on loans to Russian companies. And a lot of these companies had lived really on cross-border loans. And suddenly that flow was turned off, and a lot of business relationships suddenly grew extremely difficult. And of course, the effect of the sanctions was not only the things that were actually sanctioned, but then caution, which is exercised by bankers everywhere, suddenly comes into the equation, and the enthusiasm with which they were throwing money at Russian companies prior to 2008 never returns. So I think an orienting point for people who are trying to kind of get their heads around this is to think of 2014 as a point where the political interests of the state, which I would argue is what that decision to annex Crimea and support the so-called republics was all about, the political interests of the state come into direct conflict with the short-term economic interests of the bourgeoisie. There's an excellent article, which I can't recommend too highly, by Ilya Matveev, the economist who's based in St. Petersburg, where he talks about these two trends in Russian foreign policy and contrasts them. And I think his analysis is absolutely excellent. And this really then is the key to what happened between 2014 and to what's just happened in the last few weeks. Sorry, that's a very long answer to your question, David.
No, it's very helpful, and it brings to mind one specific idea that I just read today on Facebook. The Indian Marxist Jairus Banerjee brought up this idea of business capture in relation to Russia, and saying, well, in countries like the U.S. and Canada, Britain, and so on, you might have situations where capitalists capture the regulatory institutions of the state and influence them. And Banerjee was suggesting, well, Russia perhaps is a situation where really it's the other way around, and you have elements of the state officialdom raiding and controlling businesses. Can you kind of respond to that as an angle on understanding Russian capitalism?
So I think what, as I've described, I think when Putin arrived, and as I've said, I've certainly been convinced by this book by Catherine Belton that there's a case to be made for him arriving with a considerably more coherent and organized group of these security services officers than was obvious, to people like me observing from the outside at the time. I think when Putin arrives, I think there is this pull towards. There's not much of a pull towards state ownership. So it's not that they started nationalizing everything. They did take the assets of Yukos, the big oil company that was owned by Khodorkovsky, back into state ownership effectively by putting it into Rosneft, although that's not a 100% state-owned company. And don't forget that the oil industry in Russia now is far less state-owned than in, for example, Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. So it's not about state ownership as such, but I do think there's a level of state control, not so much on behalf of the bourgeoisie, but also over the bourgeoisie. And I think recalling what I've understood from socialist theory about authoritarian methods of capitalist rule, this is very often the case. And of course, part of this is that Russia is in terms of the world economy very much a second-rate power. It is subordinate to world markets. It is exporting these raw materials or semi-processed steel bars or whatever, semi-processed materials. And the other part of this is the failure to diversify away from dependence on these raw materials revenues, the so-called oil curse, which obviously economists who write about that stuff, that's something that's associated with countries in the global south. And of course, you can't talk about Russia as a country in the global south. It's as Ukrainians are being reminded horribly this week, it is an imperialist country. And it's also a country which, has an economy comparable with other European economies. But in terms of proceeding with that diversification, which was a real discussion in the Russian elite, in government and in business throughout the period that I've talked about, that diversification failed. And I think after 2008-09, when the going got tough, it really went off the agenda. And certainly with 2014 and the decision to prioritize the attack on Ukraine, all such aspirations for the Russian economy went out of the window, and it was very much a question of how to survive the storm of the international economic conditions.
So I've got a couple of questions connected to the relationship between Russian capitalism and the global economy. And it's particularly, I think, important to think about given Western economic sanctions and so on. So could you start by explaining for listeners to what extent Russia is dependent on foreign trade and investment, so both considering inward and also outward trade and investment?
So I've described the situation with trade, that there's this very big export of the oil, gas and metals. Foreign direct investment was coming in during those boom years, but fell sharply following the economic crisis and has been negligible since 2014. There's been some foreign investment. So there was a big gas project up in the Arctic, which was one of the sort of projects that the government really favored, which was had investment from Total and from CNPC, the Chinese oil company. And there were also some projects out in Siberia that there was some Chinese money invested in, but these levels of investment were not comparable to those during the boom years of the first decade of this century. So I don't know, do you want to go on and talk about the sanctions at this point?
Yeah, I think that would be good because this is clearly something that's being prioritized in terms of the attack on the central bank and so on. So can you say something about what you think the impact is likely to be?
So I think that the sanctions that have been announced over the past 2 weeks amount to a complete rewriting of the relationships, not only between Russia and the Western powers, but I'd say this will, even if, which unfortunately is not going to happen, even if the war were to stop tomorrow, which I'm very sad to say I don't think is a possibility, but even if that did happen, the economic map of Europe and the economic relationship between the Western powers and not only Russia, but many of the countries on its western border is changed permanently for years to come. And if we look at the sort of changes that have been made, I mean, I won't bore your listeners, David, with my in any case unrepeatable opinions about our own government and its relationship with the oligarchs and the extent to which money has poured into the Tory party here from donors who've recently been awarded British citizenship, while more deserving cases are basically left to fend for themselves. But if we look at the real sanctions that have been introduced, I mean, first of all, even before the invasion, in response to Putin's speech recognizing these so-called republics, German foreign policy made a turn more dramatic than anything since the unification of Germany, with the not only the decision to stop this extra gas pipeline, Nord Stream 2, the purpose of which was basically to relieve Gazprom, the Russian gas company, of the necessity to transit gas through Ukraine, but also to supply weapons to Ukraine in large numbers and serious money being put into that. That's an absolutely dramatic change from a country which, after all, actually trades with Russia and always saw the relationship with Russia as being key to its own future and to the future of Europe. Then we had the pullout by the oil companies. And again, it's easy on a political level to kind of laugh at their hypocrisy and Shell going off and buying some Russian oil, even after taking their decision to pull out. But nevertheless, these are relationships. And again, I mean, this is very, if you were earning your money as a financial journalist covering Russia, I mean, this was really central to what I was writing about as a journalist for years and years and years, was building up these relationships. For BP, the share in Rosneft, that big state-owned oil company, comprises a huge part of their global production. It comprises a huge part of their profits each year. And to walk away from that, apparently it's going to cost them $25 billion. Even for BP, I mean, that's a lot of money. And BP's exit was followed very rapidly by Equinor, Shell, and even ExxonMobil. So that is a change in Western policy. These guys do not take their decisions because some politician in some parliament somewhere accuses them of hypocrisy, because that's happening anyway, right? They've taken a decision because they believe that the relationship has changed and that the big Western powers are really cutting Russia loose in a way that they've cut Iran loose, in a way that they've cut Venezuela loose. And probably there are other examples. And of course, Russia's a lot bigger and has a lot more clout in Europe than either Iran or Venezuela. So this is a very different situation. And I think whatever is the outcome of this horrific conflict in Ukraine, we face a situation where the Russian economy is condemned to years of hardship, where Russian people are condemned to years of hardship behind some sort of new Iron Curtain. I it's horrible to even think about how that's going to unfold in a political and geographical way. But there's no way that Russia can now build on its potentials, that it can try to diversify away from oil and gas, which would be anyway essential in this era of climate change. These things are not going to even crawl to the top of the agenda, and to say nothing of the living standards of Russian people, which are going to suffer terribly. So these sanctions are different, I think, from sanctions in the past. I mean, to add a sort of anecdote to that, I was talking to a person who's very involved in the oil industry by phone, because wars break out and people phone up, and so somebody I'd known from my life as being involved in energy analysis, and he said, well, he thinks, and he's a lot closer to all this than I am, that Russian gas exports to Europe will be at a third or a quarter of the level that they're at now in 2, 3 or 4 years' time. Now, this is a massive, massive change. Even if that guy turns out to be wrong about that particular fact, I mean, that's the scale of change that we're talking about.
So in response, do you think the Russian government's going to be able to deepen relations with China in a way that would really allow it to offset the impact of the sanctions in some significant way?
I think that, if you invited a sort of Russian liberal observer of Russian policy, they're all outside the country now, of course, and, they're all saying on Twitter and whatever, as much as I've been able to keep up with, yeah, great, Russia can now become a colony of China. And of course, China's very picky about what it takes from Russia and how far it goes in that relationship. I mean, I just know, again, because I was working and keeping in close touch with the gas market, the big gas export project, which was supposed to diversify away. So oil you can sell onto the world market, right? But Russia's gas is primarily exported to Europe. And for years, Putin and his colleagues were talking about increasing the export trade with China. And China just delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed until they worked out how much gas they wanted, had built a pipeline from Turkmenistan to bring gas from there to China. And Turkmenistan's an enormous producer of gas, and then turned to the Russians and said, "Okay, we'll take X," and it was quite a small amount. And then they faffed around building the pipeline. It took absolutely ages. It was finished just before the pandemic, and some gas has been exported through it. But I'm using this as an illustration to show how cautious China was. And of course, I'm sure your listeners are aware of the statements that China has made about the conflict, which have fallen well short of what the Russian government must have hoped would be a strong position of support. And the Chinese government is clearly keeping its options open. And so, yes, I think Russia may, or the Russian elite may hope to fall back more on its relationship with China, but I think that's also fraught with problems. And that's why, if you had one of those Russian liberal economists on your podcast, that person would most likely be in having some hopes for the development of capitalism in the country, would be in a pit of depression at the moment.
Let's shift now and talk more about the state and government, because, again, mainstream media in the Anglosphere makes it sound like it's Putin single-handedly running the show. So from your perspective, how would you answer the question, who governs Russia?
I think because this is a podcast, I'm allowed to sort of be slightly anecdotal. I was on the phone to a very old friend and comrade the other day, and the guy said, well, I know that, we don't believe in psychological explanations for things, but Putin is going slightly crazy from where I'm standing. And I think this goes back to the point we talked about at the very beginning, David, which is, why has he done something which was so completely unexpected? And I'll tell you the reasons why I didn't expect it. I did think, because of the buildup of troops on the border and all the things that have been going on for the last few months, I did think there was going to be military activity. And I did think it was going to be in the east of the country. And I do remember saying very clearly to people, because people were asking, well, of course, there is a possibility of an all-out invasion, but it's really hard to see what Russia has to gain from that. And it does look as though Putin, let's use that word. Obviously, yes, there's a team of people, but I mean, it does look like the most titanic miscalculation, because it does, I don't understand anything about military things, but I mean, all the kind of analysts and everything I've read from all different sides all says that this looked like a very rapid move on Kiev and Kharkiv and some of the other main cities, which was designed to happen very, very, very quickly. So, for example, I mean, I think all of your listeners will know there's this great big queue of armored vehicles which seems to have got stuck outside Kiev, and now they're resorting to bombing in order to try to clear the way from it. But apparently, and again, this is something that, we've got to be very careful and use caveats, and none of us know what's going on so well on the ground, and there's a massive amount of disinformation. But even factoring all that in, it does seem that that convoy was sent out basically with kind of 3 days of supplies. So the plan was to move very, very quickly. It's not that far from the Belarusian border to Kiev, and they've got stuck. Now, so that fits with the idea of a really massive miscalculation. And it does suggest that Putin, to some extent, believes what he said in his speech. And of course, with all politicians, we have to ask whether they actually believe what they say in their speeches. And all this stuff that he said about Ukraine is not a country. Ukraine is an artificial construct. I mean, this time he blamed Lenin. Previous times, it's been a slightly different take on the history. And I mean, some literally crazy things about, for example, particularly his assertion that, which is something you can hear on variants of on Russian television as standard, that there's something which looks very like genocide, were his words, going on in the east of Ukraine in respect of attacks from the Ukrainian side on the so-called republics. So anyway, neither me nor my old comrade that I was on the phone with, neither of us think that Putin going crazy is a sufficient explanation. That's, of course, also what you can read in some of the press. But I do think, again, that this, what I spoke about in respect of 2014, where there's a divergence between this political logic and the economic logic, that divergence is greater than ever. And if business people had their heads in their hands after 2014, I mean, many of them, along, I have to say, with lots of people who've opened their mouths and criticized the government in any way whatsoever and have the means, many of those business people have now left the country because they don't see any future for Russian capitalism in the short term. They've all stashed their money off somewhere. Why would they stay? So I think there's a real schism. There's been a statement calling for a diplomatic solution, which are the sort of words you can use without being dragged off to jail, by Lukoil, which is the largest privately owned company, and also I think by Rusal, which is the aluminium producing group headed by Oleg Deripaska, who was one of the most loyal to Putin oligarchs. So I think you've got a real, on top of everything else, you've got a real split in the Russian elite. And of course, as again, I'm sure all your listeners know, I mean, you've also got tens of thousands of Russians going out in the full knowledge that they're likely to be arrested at a minimum as a punishment for doing so. You've got tens of thousands of Russians going out on the streets to protest, and hundreds of thousands signing letters and petitions with their name, with their address, and so on and so on. So, in the First World War, it took kind of 3-4 years to get to the point where you had the sort of anti-war demonstrations we're now seeing in Russia. Now, of course, I don't believe in raising false hopes, because my understanding is that the reaction from the Kremlin to that may well be to treat Ukraine in the way that it, together with Bashar al-Assad, did Aleppo or other Syrian cities. And that's a real fear I have for friends and comrades and people I know in Kiev. I think that's entirely possible. They seem to be laying waste to these smaller population centers just north of Kiev right now. So I don't take any pleasure out of this situation or have kind of stars in my eyes about the level of opposition in Russia or the depth of this split in the elite, but I think that's part of the picture.
Just to circle back before we go forward, in terms of Putin, can you say anything about, again, because of the way that we don't get very much about this in the Western media, but clearly Putin isn't acting solely by himself. There's got to be a Putin group, right, in a sense, I mean, or the faction. Can you shed some light on, the people around Putin and who they would be and so on?
There are a lot of people who've come from the security services, and that's a factor. And so I mentioned earlier Igor Sechin, who's the president of Rosneft, and Forbes, I think, runs a sort of poll on who are the really powerful people in Russia. And for the entire period when Dmitry Medvedev was the president and Putin was the prime minister, numbers 1 and 2 were Putin and Sechin, respectively. So Sechin is, obviously a very powerful person. However, I think it would be completely silly to kind of think that these security services officers as a group alone are kind of directing everything. Obviously, they have other people with whom they work. We have the Russian parliament. We have the United Russia Party. Don't forget that in Russia, a big part of national politics is about the relationship with the regions. So for the first decade or so of Putin's regime, from the first decade after 2000, you had a strong group of governors led by the governor of Tatarstan, who tried to pressure the Kremlin to get more resources for the regions and so on. That's changed. The whole system has become much more centralized. An interesting and important caveat there is the special power which is given to the rulers of Chechnya, who are a bunch of violent thugs who work closely with the Kremlin, but whose power extends not only through that very small republic, but through the Caucasus more generally. And in fact, the Chechen government has been a source of cadres for central government to some extent. When I was researching something about Russian climate policy last year, one of the guys who's in charge of climate policy is somebody who has no record at all in knowing anything about climate, which is kind of not surprising, and that's pretty much a standard internationally. And but it notably comes from Chechnya. So Chechnya is making that outsized contribution. So then you've got what you had in that first decade, that golden decade. You had a very strong group of liberals, and Kudrin was a very good example of that. He was the finance minister. He worked very well with Putin and Medvedev, and then he was dismissed. But he's still there. He still operates in the Russian political space. I think there are some of those kind of competent bureaucratic managers. So the governor of the central bank, Elvira Naibulina, she's there. She's taking a lot of difficult decisions. She's an economist. There's a piece in the Financial Times yesterday speculating as to what she must be thinking now. There's no sign that she would be an enthusiastic supporter of this war any more than others of that sort of background. And then, of course, you've got the Russian parliament. So you've got United Russia, which is the pro-Putin party, which is the ruling party. But you've also got, importantly, Just Russia. You've got the Liberal Democratic Party, which in the Russian case is an extreme right-wing party led by Vladimir Zhirinovsky. And then you've got Just Russia, and you've got, of course, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which used to be the largest, I think probably still is, the largest opposition party. And, of course, it was Just Russia and the Communist Party of the Russian Federation that built up the relationship with you've got to call them armed militiamen who control the republics in Donetsk and Luhansk, and who then, it was the Communist Party that proposed the motion in parliament. And clearly this was working closely, as they have been doing throughout the Putin period, with United Russia. It was they that proposed the motion to recognize the republics, and then that was kind of ushered through parliament in a very sort of performative way. I mean, just for the record, I've got to say there are 2 Communist Party deputies who've subsequently come out and said, we don't think that a war can be justified on that basis. There would be many of my socialist friends and radical political friends in Russia who would say, it's a bit late to think of that now.
Now, Historian Tony Wood has said that he's described Putin as an ideal arbiter for different interests within the Russian elite. I mean, do you think that's been true up to this point? How would you like to add to anything you said before about the relationship between Putin and the capitalist class?
I think it was true up to 2014. I wonder. I wonder what Tony thinks about the period since 2014. I suspect, knowing what an acute observer of Russia he is, I suspect he would also kind of think that 2014 was a big step in that breaking down. But if I may, another anecdote, if you like, I also didn't think that Putin would annex Crimea, so that tells you how much I know. And I went round asking every Russian I met for some years afterwards, if it was appropriate to the conversation, to why did he do it? And the best answer I ever received was somebody who was, not only an acute observer, but an awful lot closer to the whole setup than Tony Wood or I or any foreigner. And that person said because he couldn't afford to go down in history as being the guy who didn't do it. In other words, when Ukraine got into that confused and unstable situation, and of course, Ukrainians, or some Ukrainians would tell you, well, there was always a plan. It was sitting there in the Ministry of Defense. Yeah, but I mean, they got plans for everything in the Ministry of Defense. The point is, why did they pick on that one at that time? And the answer from this person, which I think was very convincing to me, was that he couldn't afford not to because of the strength of this nationalist lobby. And I think that's the other thing, really, if we're talking about Russian politics, this is what we've got to account for, because you haven't asked me about this, but I'll offer you this opinion anyway. We have to account for why Putin felt it necessary to go ahead in 2014 and why he's felt it necessary to go ahead this year with these measures in Ukraine, which are so clearly damaging, as I've said, to the bourgeoisie in short-term economic terms. And to me, first of all, as that answer from that person implies, first of all, the pressure from the nationalist elements in the state, from the militarist elements in the state. But I think also there's another angle, which is very often ignored by people in the West, including those on the left. And that is, it's about social control. We shouldn't forget that not only was the 2014 overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine, not only was it not a fascist coup, which is just a kind of ridiculous piece of post-Stalinist oversimplification. Not only was it not a fascist coup, and I mean, I don't think it was a kind of, it wasn't all flowery and happy either. But what it was, without question, was a mass movement. And the change of government took place because, in the case of Kiev, I mean, half the population was on the street. And I'm talking about on the street for 2 weeks in the middle of winter. It was very, very cold that winter. Yes, were there fascists in the crowd? Undoubtedly. Were my socialist friends in the crowd? Undoubtedly. Was everybody in between in the crowd? Undoubtedly. But you cannot describe a change of government which happens by half the population being on the street and huge crowds in other cities mobbing the police stations and breaking into them and so on. You cannot describe that as a coup. It just doesn't, analytically, it just doesn't make any sense. And then you have a government which, again, I mean, I don't think for your listeners we need to kind of go through all these post-Stalinist oversimplifications, but all this nonsense about a fascist government and so on. I mean, yes, it was a right-wing government, but the fascists got the same votes in Ukraine as they do in other European countries. They're well below 10%, thank goodness. Of course, there's a difference in Ukraine, which is as soon as the conflict became military, a lot of them got hold of guns, as our socialist friends in Ukraine know, to their great cost. And it's been very difficult for them working in those conditions. But the point is that event in 2014, I think all the evidence is that seriously worried Moscow. It seriously worried the Kremlin. It seriously worried Putin because, and this is where the fact that Ukraine is Russia's oldest and nearest colony, just as Ireland is Britain's oldest and nearest colony, this is where that fact becomes relevant, because this was really too close to home. there was a big movement in Russia in 2011-12 in response to the increasing perception, particularly in Moscow, that elections were being fixed by this United Russia machine. But the movement in 2014 in Ukraine obviously dwarfed that. And it did overthrow a government, which really was not things going to plan from Moscow's point of view. So I don't think this is the whole explanation, but I think you have to say that the control of the Russian population, the ensuring that things didn't go that way in Russia, and also the mobilizing of national feeling. I mean, there was a horrendous wave of nationalism after the annexation of Crimea, and Putin's ratings went through the roof. I mean, they were always very high because he was seen as somebody who restored order, and with the oil boom, there'd been increasing living standards throughout that first decade. But with Crimea, although living standards by that time were falling and people were getting worried about the social conditions, it gave him a huge bump in popularity. And there are many tales that Russian friends and comrades tell about the horrendous kind of level of sort of street level nationalism, people wearing Putin T-shirts and people standing up in offices and saluting the television, which is strange behavior in any country at any time. And these things were going on, and that is a method of social control. And we're going to see more of that on all sides, I'm afraid, now under the conditions of the current war. And of course, we will all, as socialists and internationalists, resist that kind of pressure in whatever country we live.
I think the last major question I want to bring up is about Putin's aims, at least the initial aims in attacking Ukraine. And obviously this is speculative, but do you have any thoughts about the initial war aims and what they might now be?
I think it's now clear that the war was designed to split Ukraine, to split Ukrainian territory. I had thought prior to the invasion that we would get a push out from the republics. I mean, I think most people I know in Ukraine expected an attempt, for example, to make this land bridge between Crimea and those republics and to try to take more territory in Donetsk and Lugansk regions. I think that it's clear the war aims are now greater than that. The declared war aims we're all familiar with, that Ukraine has to demilitarize, that the government is going to, it's not clear what the war aim is with respect to the government. I mean, the other thing that I find difficult to understand, I don't have any answer for, is if we look at the very little we know so far about the areas that the Russian army has taken under its control in the last week. Kherson, which is a Russian-speaking city, by vast majority, I don't know what the figure is, but the vast majority of people in Kherson are Russian speakers. The mayor is still there. He has told people, don't go around in groups of more than two, and don't do this and don't do that, and so on and so on and so on. The Ukrainian flag continues to fly above the city hall, but then yesterday there were these pictures from the local radio station of these huge demonstrations in the middle of Kherson with Ukrainian flags being flown, and occupiers go home, and so on and so on. Now, I suppose the terrible lesson of Syria, which is in my view, the great defeat of our social movements so far in this century, the terrible lesson of Syria is that no matter the level of popular resistance, you can obliterate it with sufficient violence. That's the most horrifying prospect, and I can't discount that. But what I would also say is that level of popular resistance, which is clearly there, and it's not only in Kherson, we're seeing evidence of that all over the place. That's very much part of the equation. And I hope that when we're discussing this in the States, in Canada, in the UK, in other European countries, I mean, let's not make the mistake of thinking of this in terms of the relationship between governments and armies. No matter how powerful governments and armies are, in the end, people are part of this dynamic, whether those governments and armies like it or not. And what I see none of is if you recall in Putin's initial speech on the Thursday when the invasion began, he called on Ukrainian people to rise up and overthrow their Nazi oppressors. And I was speaking with a Ukrainian friend, somebody who lives here, who wouldn't call herself a socialist. And she said, well, yeah, I know people who actually support Russia and who probably welcome Putin. I've got distant relatives. We've all stopped speaking about politics long ago, and so on and so on. But actually, so far, we see, even in the areas where Russian troops are in control, which are Russian-speaking areas, we see absolutely no sign of that happening whatsoever, whereas we do see signs of this sort of almost people's war sort of reaction to the arrival of the Russian army. So all I want to say, David, is, again, not to think that it's all going to be flowers and happiness, but just to say that that's the uncertainties with which we're now dealing.
Thanks. And just to wrap up, perhaps you could say something about your website, People and Nature, because I find it a very valuable resource for learning about things taking place in Russia in terms of protest and social struggle, but also lots of ecological political issues as well. So could you just tell people a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David. Obviously, I hope people will go and have a look. It's peoplenature.org. The direct links are blocked by Facebook, which is a sort of occupational hazard, but I take it as a big compliment from Mark Zuckerberg. Yeah, I mean, I've been writing the blog for a while. I started it off very much intending to concentrate on ecological issues, fossil fuels, and the whole dynamic in terms of climate. And really that changed in 2014 when the events in Ukraine took place. Then I started writing more about Russia and Ukraine because I felt that I should share some of the things I know. I translate a fair bit from activists in that part of the world, and yeah, visitors are welcome. And I'm there on WhatsApp and Instagram and Telegram and everything you can imagine. No TikTok videos yet, but who knows what the future will bring.
Thanks very much, Simon. That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.